Well, we're finishing the Gospel of Mark today, and suitably, we're finishing it on Easter morning. I did that on purpose. Looked at the calendar. We came back to Mark after studying it last year. We stopped studying Mark right around Thanksgiving when I left the country, and so we're picking it up and timed it so that the last breathing words of Mark would be today on the Resurrection Day. So that's what we're looking at today. And I'm always sad when we finish a book, because I have so enjoyed looking at Mark, looking at the gospel. And I have to tell myself, I'm not closing it forever. I can actually go back and read it tomorrow morning. I can start all over again. And that's what I've been doing my entire life, is finishing these books, going back to the beginning and say, I got to do that again. I got to read this again. So this is where we left the story last week. We left the story last week where the he in that top sentence is Joseph of Arimathea. So he had successfully convinced Pilate to let him take the body of Jesus and to put it in his own burial place. This is a picture of an actual first century dated tomb. So not probably Jesus' tomb, in fact, for sure not, because this is a little ways outside of Jerusalem. But this is exactly what they were like. So you had a stone outcropping that would poke out of the hillside. And this stone outcropping, then you would pay some workers to chisel out of the solid stone, to chisel out a room inside there to be a tomb. That's what you do. And so they'd painstakingly chisel out that solid rock. Fortunately, in Israel, most of the rock that's there is limestone. It's much easier to do than, say, granite. They chisel that out. They would leave a channel in the front, and this channel in the front was put there so that you could roll this stone in place. You'd make yourself a big round stone. Again, a very expensive piece of masonry work, a round stone. But they would make the round stone, they would make the channel, and the channel would go slightly uphill in the open side. So, and then you put a little pebble down about the size of a marble, just to keep it from rolling back in front. Hold it up there. When someone would die, you'd wrap the body, you put it inside on the shelf inside, lay it on that shelf, and then you'd close the door by just taking the pebble off the bottom of that big round stone, and it would boom and shut. It took usually on the order of 5 to 6 men to roll it uphill to get it open. It was sealed. It was just sealed. And then about a year later, you would go in and you would separate the bones out of that wrapped body and put just the bones inside of a bone box. It's about the size of a footlocker, and you would take the bones of all your relatives and stack them up inside this footlocker. And that's what you did a year after the death. Yeah. Well, here's where we left things. So Jesus is in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, and a couple of women, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid, and they decided to kind of stand vigil there. We're going to look at some of my favorite pictures from Jacques Tissot, and here's one of his pictures of the two women just waiting outside the tomb. Don't let it distract you that for many of the believing women in Tissot's pictures, they all look like they're dressed like nuns. Don't let that distract you. It's just the way he had spiritual women like that. But not only that, later on, after they were there, in fact, immediately when the body was put in there, they commanded to have some soldiers put there. So here's Tissot's idea of what it looks like to have the soldiers guarding that tomb. And they were told to guard it and make sure that no one ever came and took the body. That was their charge, because the guys in charge of them, their supervisors, knew that Jesus had said, I'm going to pop out in 3 days. And they said, no, you guys stand guard. Make sure no one comes and steals the body and starts this lie. So they were there to guard the body. This is actually an underestimate of the number of guards that were there. It was a pretty good guarding group. It would be very hard to get past them. So last week we looked at the fact that whole scenario that we finished last week that's Jesus overcoming to be put in a tomb. Well, not until the third day. And that's where we are today. So what I want to look at all through today is don't be unbelieving, be believing. And the interesting thing is at the end of Mark's gospel, it's one account after another of people who would not believe that the resurrection actually happened. And the people closest to him, in fact, until they finally do. Plot spoiler. So don't be unbelieving, but be believing. Does that phrase ring a bell with you? We'll come back to it. Okay, let's look at today. So I told you there'd be about 4 scenes. Here's a scene that starts in chapter 16, verse 1. So this is how we finish the book of Mark. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. Of course, the problem is, on their way, very early on the first day of the week when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb and they were saying to one another, well, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? They realized that between them, they didn't have enough strength to do it. And they went early in the morning, so there probably wouldn't be anybody up. So how are we going to do what we want to do? We don't know, but we're going to go to the tomb anyway. So they bring spices to do that. Verse 4, and then looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. I like how Mark puts that. The stone was rolled away, and it was very large. It was very large. Well, again, in Tiso's picture here, what happened to all the guards? Well, he's got them laying on the ground, knocked out. That's as good a thought as anyone else's. Some people think they ran away once this thing happened, when all of a sudden there was this angel thing going on right there. They freaked out and ran. But in Tiso's mind, no, we think they just all fainted. So you have the women kind of walking all over the guards, which is kind of a fun thought. But anyway, looking up, they saw the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. Mark is a master of understatement. The rock, it was very large. This scene, they were alarmed. Yeah, okay. It was this they had not expected. This they had not expected. And he said to them, "Oh, don't be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him." And presumably he actually points to the spot. There's usually a ledge. It looks like a couch kind of. It's a ledge inside these tombs. If you go to Jerusalem, there's another first century tomb that's in a garden kind of tomb place, they call it. It's outside of Jerusalem proper downtown, and it's called Gordon's Calvary. But there they have a big garden, and then there's this tomb there, and you can walk inside of it. And sure enough, when you walk inside this hewn out rock tomb, you walk inside, there's that ledge about thigh high right there where the bodies would be laid for a year. So he points to that, we think. It says, "See the place where they laid him?" And sure enough, he's not there. He's not there. But he goes on, "Go tell his disciples and Peter." Go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you. Just as he told you. So Jesus had already warned them that this meeting was going to happen up in Galilee. So basically the angel is telling her, go back and tell them what they already know, and make sure you tell everyone, and Peter, and do just as he told you. Okay, so we go into verse 8, and they went out and they fled from the tomb. Fled is actually a very powerful running word. They fled from the tomb because trembling and astonishment had seized them. Trembling and astonishment. Trembling and astonishment. Talked about being of two minds. Trembling, fear, astonishment, whoa. Yeah, trembling and astonishment. And they said nothing to anyone. They were afraid. They were paralyzed. It's a fascinating thing. So here they believe, but the trembling and astonishment is working against them. And although they're told by the angel who's there to go back and talk to the disciples and Peter, they don't do it. They said nothing to anyone. Now, if you're thinking as you're sitting there, wait a second, I know the resurrection story. Some women did talk to the apostles. So what's going on here? Well, this is what we call a harmony of the Gospels exercise for you, because the Gospels all tell the same story in the resurrection, but with a few extra viewpoints which capture a few more elements of the story. So we actually have a couple of trips to the tomb that happened this morning. This isn't the only one. So that's how you add these together side by side, and these can all work. They're not in conflict, but the same is true if you go into a court of law. Say like if you saw a traffic accident, and you had three different witnesses who see the traffic accident, they will tell essentially the same story, but with slightly different additions because they had different perspectives, because they saw stuff that the other people couldn't see. That's how the Gospels work. They tell the same story, but with slightly different perspectives, they add things that others left out. So to get a complete picture of what happens at the tomb, you got to look at all the Gospels to get the fuller picture. So there was some telling of the apostles, but at least from these first that went, they were paralyzed by the truth, just paralyzed by it. They believed it. They think they believed it, But their belief was changed by the fact that they're terrified and they're astonished at the same time. I don't know if you've ever come upon a fact or a truth or something you've seen that was astonishing. You almost don't want to tell people because they'll think, no, you didn't see that. No, I really did. It was up in the sky and it went faster than a plane. Well, that's the UFO stories. But I mean, you're kind of hesitant to tell these stories because they're so astonishing that you yourself are just barely believing them. How are you going to be able to convince someone else that it actually happened? Yeah, it's really hard. So the astonishment part kind of stops you from talking to anybody, and the trembling part makes it just physically impossible for you to tell it convincingly. However, that trembling ought to be an evidence of the fact that what you saw is true. So they're just paralyzed. And I get this. I think if any of us were in their situations, quiet morning, go into the tomb, sun's just coming up, who's going to roll the stone? I don't know. Did you bring the myrrh? Yeah, I got the myrrh. Did anyone bring the frankincense? Yeah, I got that. Okay, here we go. Ah! Right? You'd be astonished. You don't expect this. They're paralyzed. But they did believe, I believe, but they're still wrestling with what they saw. Okay, let's go to the next scene. Oh, wait, we're not going to go to the next scene. I have a translator note for you. Did you know that the next verses we're going to look at are somewhat in question as being part of the original account by Mark? I don't bring this up very often, but it's worthwhile that you know this. From this point on, in verse 9 to the end of the book, there's something that changes in the narrative, and you can see this in an English translation. You can see it after what we just read in verse 8 and prior. It has a certain narrative rhythm to it, how it expands the details, how it does stuff. It's consistently one writer up through this part of verse 8 in chapter 16. But starting at verse 9 here, something happens, and it suddenly gets choppy and short and condensed. And you can read it. If you just stay back, you can read it. So many times over the years, people have said, this is a very odd change in the style of the narrative, right at verse 9. I wonder what's going on. And then over the years, over the last 100 years, as they have uncovered old handwritten copies of the Gospels, including Mark, they find handwritten copies that date back very far back, like in the 2nd and 3rd century AD, and then some of them that came up in the 8th and 9th century AD. I mean, you find fragments of Mark from copies that have been copied and carried forward and copied and carried forward. And out of this kind of spectrum of these little pieces and bits that were written in different centuries, you look at the more recent century ones, and they have what we're going to read next in verse 9 to the end. They have that. But if you reach back to some of the earlier bits of those copies, they stop at verse 8. What? So that's why in many modern translations, it'll say exactly this very thing. It'll say some of the earliest manuscripts, they don't include what comes next. So how to explain this? This is the best explanation. The last page fell off of Mark somewhere. No kidding. Everyone's pretty sure that what Mark wrote, and then what comes after verse 8 in Mark 16, somehow that page got lost or ripped off or damaged or something like that. So that's the best explanation. So to show it to you more visibly, it's more like this. If that was all of Mark's original gospel from top to bottom, including his original end to the gospel, somewhere along the line, and very early so, it got damaged and the end of the book was lost. It makes sense that the beginning or the end of the account would be lost because that's at the ends of the scroll or the book, the way they kind of bind it. So that makes more sense. But at that point then, people still wanted the Gospel of Mark from that 2nd century. So they started copying that. And what we had in the earliest copies we have, which is represented in the middle there, it's Mark that only goes up through verse 8. That's what's in the oldest pieces that we have. There's nothing after 8 in the copies. It's kind of weird. But then sometime later, older pieces have not only that part right there, but something that looks kind of obviously appended to it because the language changes. It becomes more abrupt and condensed. Someone, it looks like, and this is the guesswork that goes on when you do textual criticism in Bible scraps to put together the New Testament. It looks as though someone recognized, as we do, that Mark 8 shouldn't be the end. 16:8 should not be the end of the story. Because See how far we got in this story? There's still a lot to go in this story. That can't be the end of Mark's original gospel. That doesn't make any sense. So someone noticed that like we do and said, well, I've read the other gospels. Maybe what we need to do is let's just write a quick summary of what happens after this part at the end of the extant portion of Mark's gospel. Let's add a summary, kind of a condensed version, and stick it on there so people don't think the story ended where 16:8 ends. This keeps going after that. So the best guess, and this is a guess, is that well-intentioned people between the oldest copies we have in the middle and the newer copies that we have on the right side over there added this appendage so that you know that the story doesn't stop at Mark 16:8. It goes on after that. But here's kind of like a condensed version of what goes on after that. If you look in the other Gospels, the events that happen after the end of 16:8 in the other Gospels takes up a lot of pages. So we lost a chunk of stuff someplace. So someone said, we don't want to leave people in the dark. Let's just do a summary and stick it on. So what we're going to look at now at verse 9 looks like this well-intentioned addition to Mark to fill out the rest of the story. But it's condensed. So you're going to miss a lot of the events. You need to read the other Gospels to find those. And by the way, I'll get off this for a second because this is just an interesting thing. You need to know about this. This happens in spotty places throughout the New Testament especially, where you find, the middle documents and the far right documents, they don't quite... There's things slightly different. How do you deal with those differences? And that's a whole study called textual criticism. So you can make some very educated guesses about that. However, the differences, if you look at them, never affect a core doctrine of the gospel. Never do. And in fact, 9 times out of 10, the changes, if there's additions, the additions are well-intentioned clarifications to what's there, but they're not non-biblical, they're not against the gospel. They're supportive. So it looks as though scribes over the millennia have added a little bit to clarify what's going on in the But when you compare these and they're different, the differences have nothing to do with the gospel, have nothing to do with doctrine. They have everything to do with well-intentioned clarifications from the writers. So that's just to let you know. That's the realm of textual criticism. Thought I'd let you know that before we move on. If you watch now as we move on to the rest of the story, you'll notice how fast it goes and how condensed it seems. That's why it's different in terms of Mark's style. But it's still very accurate. It represents, in a condensed form, what the other Gospels say happened after this point in the story. And that's okay. So that's what we're going to do. Here we go. That part right there is what's in question, 16:9 through 20. And again, I'll just mention that section in the modern translations almost always has a little flag in your Bible or some kind of asterisk. It'll say, well, what's coming up on the rest of Mark's gospel, it's not in the oldest documents, but, we're going to include it here because it's accurate. It matches the other gospels. So here we go. Okay. Here we are, verse 9. Now, when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. Well, this is interesting. This is somewhat of not an overlap to what he's included already, but it's a side story that you get from the other Gospels, the Mary Magdalene story here. So this has been included actually from one of the other Gospels. Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. By the way, Magdala is a city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. So this is Mary of Magdala, in case you didn't know that. Mary Magdalene. She went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. What? What? Now, the first 2 women, according to Mark's gospel, didn't even go talk to him. Mary Magdalene does go talk to them. And in the end, is it convincing to them? Well, no. No. Now, they're emotional wrecks. You see the beginning of this section right here? It says they mourned and wept. I mean, they're in seclusion. They've been in seclusion for 3 days. The whole weekend, they've been in turmoil, wondering whether they misjudged who this Jesus guy was. I mean, after all, if he is the Messiah, how in the world can they kill him? Because the Messiah is not supposed to be killable, according to what the Old Testament says. In fact, the Messiah is more powerful than everybody else. So how can this? So the whole weekend, their minds are just roiling about how can this be? And not only that, but they left behind a lot to follow Jesus for 3 years. And now they're wondering, should we go back to what we left? I mean, what do our futures look like? So there's a lot of uncertainty about their futures hanging over this weekend. Tons of uncertainties about the identity of Jesus, who they thought they had figured out. It wasn't very long before this that Jesus asked them, who do people say that I am? And they offer a couple things they've heard, and then Peter steps up and says, you're the Messiah, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. So it sounds like they got it, but he's not supposed to die. That's the part of the identity of the Messiah that they just couldn't wrap their heads around. And actually nobody could. That's why this was such a surprise. So here they are, sequestered, terrified, mourning, weeping, and Mary Magdalene, which, by the way, according to this passage itself, did not have a stellar reputation historically, she comes in and says, well, I've seen him. And they go, nope, you haven't. Why would they say that? Well, because they're thinking, if Jesus is going to show up raised from the dead, he would come to us first, don't you think? We're his apostles. You're one of the women that tagged around with us all through Galilee. I mean, why would he show up to you and just to you? I mean, just you saw and nobody else? You can understand their skepticism. It makes a lot of sense. And plus, they're emotionally wrought. So they don't believe him. So this is what I call the disbelieving 11. The disbelieving 11. Only part 1. There's more disbelieving 11 to come up. Mark's addition here seems to center on the reticence of people to believe the truth of what happened. So he goes on. Part 2 of the disbelieving 11. Yeah. Well, here we go. After these things, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country. And of course, they were on their way to Emmaus, the 2 going to Emmaus. We see this in one of the other Gospels again, and it tells us they were on their way. It was now the end of the first day of the week. The women's reports were at the beginning of the day, at dawn. The guys walking to Emmaus are kind of hustling to get to Emmaus, which is 7 miles out of town, before dusk. It's the end of the day. The end of the day, Jesus walks with them to Emmaus. You can read this in the other Gospels. So this inclusion of Mark says there was that as well. Jesus appeared to these 2 guys who were walking. And in the other Gospel, it tells us that as they walked those 7 miles, which, if you start from Jerusalem, it'll take you about 2 hours to get to Emmaus. He tells them all about himself, the Messiah, in the Old Testament. Wouldn't that have been a great eavesdrop? And they don't recognize him. For some reason, they don't recognize him. They get all the way to the house in Emmaus. They come into the house. They convince him, although he wants to keep going, they convince him to come in and at least sit down and have some dinner because it's dinner time, it's dusk. And as they're in there sitting down at dinner, he breaks the bread, and in breaking the bread at dinner, they go, boing, oh, it's Jesus. And then he disappears. And they say, our hearts were burning the whole time he was here. And immediately they get up from dinner and they go all the way back to Jerusalem, another 2-hour walk back to Jerusalem for the purposes of telling the apostles who were sequestered, who are dying in this doubt, that they have seen Jesus and he walked with us all the way to our house. And they went back and told the rest, but they didn't believe him. The disbelieving 11, part 2, but they did not believe them. Okay, wait a second. These guys we know had some credibility with the apostles. I mean, these guys were insiders in many respects. And so if they come back, they tell the guys in the room, look, we've walked with Jesus and we made the trip all the way back here in the dark to tell you. And they go, nah, I don't think so. Now, I'd like to think that I'd be smarter than them, but I don't think I would be. This resurrection of Jesus means a lot. It's a gigantic turning point for the apostles and for everybody. I mean, this means everything. It's kind of like when something important happens, you have to have a level of evidence that's of the same magnitude as the importance of what it means. You know what I'm talking about? So you need to have gigantic evidence for a gigantic pivot in history. And that's what Jesus was. If he rose from the dead, it means so many things. I want to really be rock solid sure. That's where I would be. And if Mary Magdalene came in and told me, I'd be skeptical. I'd go, well, whatever. If the 2 guys walked all the way back, I'd give them a little credit for the fact that they walked all the way back in the dark to tell me. So there must be something to this. So the evidence is starting to mount in my mind Maybe they saw a ghost or something in the dark. After all, it's dusk. I don't know. But this is kind of interesting. So you guys, when you were walking with him, why didn't you recognize him? Well, I don't know, but we didn't. Yeah, okay. You know what I mean? This would be you need, for a massive change in truth, you need a massive change of evidence. And it hadn't quite gotten over the threshold for them at this point. So that's Disbelieving 11, part 2. There's a part 3 of the Disbelieving 11. Well, okay. Afterward, Jesus himself appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at table, and he rebuked them for their unbelief and their hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. This is Jesus in front of the guys saying, what is your problem? But here I am. Now what do you say? So I think this probably got them over the hump in terms of believing, because there's Jesus standing in their midst. Jesus knew it was going to be hard for them to believe, because it meant a gigantic thing in their lives and in the gospel itself, and even belief in who God is, his plans for Israel. I mean, so many things change and pivot on the resurrection. They want to have solid, absolute, see you in the face kind of proof. And here it is. Now, we know from one of the other Gospels that prior to this, there was also a meeting with Jesus there, but one of the apostles was missing. Remember who? Thomas. And even in the midst of the 10 seeing Jesus, which this addendum doesn't show, when the 10 see Jesus and Thomas isn't there, they tell Thomas, look, man, he was with us. And Thomas goes, yeah, I don't think so. And we always make fun of Thomas. But Thomas is just doing what they all did until Jesus showed up. And he said, look, unless I get to touch his hands, unless I get the same advantage you get, eye to eye, touch where the nails went, I'm not going to believe. So he's like that for almost a week. And then Jesus shows up again in this same kind of scene, and that's the one that's covered right here when all 11 are there. And then Jesus comes up to him and says, well, how about now? So quit making fun of the apostles, because you would do the same thing. I mean, nobody rises from the dead. So you really want to have some ironclad evidence. Now, I would prefer seeing him face to face, Thomas says, and so would we. The Disbelieving 11, part 3. And now there's Jesus chastising him for that very thing. There's an interesting irony in their resistance up until this point, and you'll see it in a second. Okay, now we change from the Disbelieving 11 to the Believing 11. So he says, okay, so here's what's going to happen now that you believe what happened. He says to them, go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. And this is the irony that comes from this. They were resistant to listening to ironclad eyewitness testimony of the resurrection in Jesus, and now they are being sent around the world to give their eyewitness testament to the raising of Jesus, and they're going to be met with disbelief so many places. And they're going to understand it, because they'll say, you know what? I understand your resistance to believing. I was there too. But I'm here to tell you, I saw him face to face. It's real. That's the irony of this. God put them in the shoes of themselves when they come and meet people who are met with eyewitnesses and still won't believe. That's going to be their job from now on, is to do that very thing. Go to the whole world, proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. And by the way, when it says the world, he means not just Israel. Jesus, as the Messiah, is the promised Son of God, who is the King of Israel. But as you read the scriptures throughout, it's larger than just the King of Israel. He's actually the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And we talked about that last week. I mean, the offer for what he brings for life is an offer made to the whole world, not just to Israel. So that's why this addendum adds that really clearly. They went to the whole world. They spread out. And by the way, the word apostle means to arrange for someone to be away. Apo is away. Stol is to arrange or to stand. So these are people whose jobs are to be away, not here, to be away and talk about the gospel. So that's why I emphasize all the time, if you ever hear the Greek word apostle, Apostle for us is probably best translated missionary, because a missionary we know is someone who is sent away to speak to other people who don't believe. Well, if someone calls himself an apostle and they're not sent away to speak away, they're not really being an apostol. They're being a local administrator. An apostle is someone who is not local, who's sent away. We have evidences with extra biblical accounts historically of where some of the apostles went, and they're very strong. And some of them are a little speculative about their authenticity, but some of them are pretty rock solid, and they went very far afield. We are very sure that a couple of them went up into Britain. Very sure. We are very sure that Thomas and another went to India. Very sure. So the historical evidences about how far and wide they went, when it says they went to the world, they went to the world. They spread out. They did not just stay home. A lot of people think, well, if you're one of the 12 apostles, then what we need to do is set ourselves up nice church here in Jerusalem. We need to put someone in charge, and we all need to be the 12 apostles in charge of this here church in Jerusalem. But largely, they're not there. They came back every now and then to report, but they didn't do that. They didn't establish a church in Jerusalem with the apostles as the board of leaders of this church. They all got up on their donkeys and left town, and they spent the remainder of their lives apostol, set apart away, talking about Jesus. That's an apostle. That's an apostle. And Jesus goes on. He says, look, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. Whoa. Belief is central. Belief is central. Understanding who Jesus is and believing what his role was. Now, when we started into Mark, I said there's a really cool thing in Mark that answers 3 key questions about Jesus. And it's easy to find. It's in Mark 8. It's the central chapter of all of Mark. And in Mark 8, it answers 3 principal questions. Who is Jesus? Why did he come? And what does he expect of his followers? Who is Jesus? Why did he come? What does he expect of his followers? It's in Mark 8. So if anyone ever asks you, who is Jesus? Why did he come? And what does he expect of his followers? Go to Mark 8, and you'll see it near the end of Mark 8. Those 3 questions are answered in that sequence, boom, 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 right there near the end of Mark 8. So we answer those questions, and then from Mark 8 to here in 16, he's been reaffirming those things as he goes along. Because the second question is, why did he come? And the answer to that question was to be sacrificed. And this is it right here. And raised again. Belief is everything. Belief in what? Belief in who Jesus is. And I might add, not just belief in the historical existence of Jesus, but to actually believe that he is the Son of God, that he's the promised Messiah, that in a really miraculous way, he's divine in every respect. He is both man and God together. And then he goes on, and he says, you're going to love these. We're going to try this out this week. And there will be signs that accompany all those who believe. In my name, they will cast out demons. Well, that's pretty cool. We actually see that happen in Acts. They will speak new tongues. Well, that happened actually on Pentecost. They were speaking the national tongues of over a dozen different places. They'll speak in new tongues. They'll pick up serpents with their hands. Next week, here, Main Street Church. You laugh. Actually, there was an event in the Apostle Paul's life near the end of his tour where he's reaching over to put a stick in a fire. Remember that? And a snake comes out of the wood pile and grabs onto him. He gets it off of his arm, and everyone who's there around the campfire is thinking, well, he's toast. He's gone. But he doesn't die. And the testimony of that fact that he didn't die, even though he was bitten by that snake, which they knew, they were locals, they knew that snake should kill you. They said, well, maybe there's something about this guy. So we do know that happened, at least that time. They'll pick up serpents with their hands. By the way, some of my relatives in eastern Kentucky, in the Appalachian region of our, it's the hillbilly area. You know hillbillies? This is where a lot of churches in the country are located that routinely do this on Sundays. They got a little box. They got holes punched in the box. They got snakes in the box. And they handle the snakes. No, we're not going to do that. And check this out. If they drink any deadly poison, it won't hurt them. Well, that's kind of interesting. I don't know anyone who actively drinks poison trying to tempt the grace of God. Do you know of any? I don't think I know of any. But let's not start that either. And they'll lay their hands on the sick and they'll recover. Well, we see a lot of that in Acts. I mean, that really does happen. But these signs will accompany those who believe. Why do they need these signs to accompany these people? Well, so that there would be credibility for the apostles as they preached what they preached. They would say, look, I'm a first-hand witness to the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah, we saw how far that went even in this account. For some people, that's not quite enough. But there's accompanying signs that go along with what they say, which give people pause to say, well, maybe there's something more than meets the eye about this guy's authenticity, if this is what happens. That is the primary reason why you see signs and miracles in the New Testament, is in order to give credibility to people who have no natural credibility in the places they go. That's why. So then he starts to wrap off the end of the gospel. So then the Lord Jesus, after he'd spoken to them, was taken up into heaven, sat down on the right hand of God. We have that account very clearly in some of the other gospels. He goes back to the Mount of Olives and is raised up in their sight. And as he goes away, some angels appear and they say to the people staring up in the sky, why are you looking in the sky? Well, because this same Jesus will come back the same way he left, which is an interesting reference to the fact that he'll come back on the Mount of Olives. So this day, if you visit Israel, you go to Jerusalem, you go to the Mount of Olives, which is opposite the city. There's the city right there. You're on the eastern side of the city. At the very top of the Mount of Olives, there's a little, I don't know what you call it, a cupola, like a mini worship spot. It's about the size of 1.5 telephone booths, maybe a little bigger. And inside, there's an exposed rock on the ground where someone said that's where he ascended into heaven. We don't know. However, interestingly enough, Tissot captured in his picture here what he saw when he went to that same place when he was there in the late 19th century. There's two foot places right down here because people for so many years have gone into that little worship spot and they've gone and they put their feet on these rubbed out. So there's these 2 rubbed out spots. And some people will say, yeah, that's where Jesus was standing. I don't know if that's as relevant as the fact that that's where thousands of people have slipped their feet in over hundreds of years. But it is kind of startling when you see it, because you see this little cupola, it's a cover and there's a rock, and you look down and go, oh, that's wow. But don't get fooled by that stuff. But Tissot captured that right here. There's the 2 footprints right down there. And indeed, they are facing that way. They're facing away from Jerusalem. I don't know why. So anyway, you read so much more about this whole process in the other Gospels, even in the first chapter of Acts. So again, what you're reading here is a very condensed version of the history that unfolded very quickly after this time. And as he brings it to a total close, and they went out, they apostled, they went out and preached everywhere while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by accompanying signs. And there he says it. That's the purpose of the signs. So again, today there's a lot of bogus signs and miracles that go about, masquerading as coming from God. The issue is if they're being used for the same purpose they did here, which was to give credibility in a situation where there's no credibility, I might entertain the thought that there's something real about them. But when I see these things happen in churches, for instance, where the need for credibility is not needed, then I question the need for them, because this clearly is the connection, and it shows up so many places. Okay, that's the end of Mark. But did you catch verse 9 to the end, how condensed that seems to be? There's so many other events that happened after the raising of Jesus, and even this condensed version doesn't touch on a lot of them. It just mentions them in passing, sometimes just a phrase. We're pretty sure it's someone's attempt to fill in the rest of the story in an abbreviated fashion, attach it to the end of Mark. There's nothing wrong with it. Everything there is accurate and is supported by the other gospel accounts. That's okay. So this is just an abbreviated version. So this is really what I wanted to get at today. You need to be believing but not unbelieving. And Jesus is very intent on you believing. He doesn't want you to believe because you're just kind of giving up all your reason. No, the apostles, in their reasoning, wanted to make sure. They wanted to really have some evidence. Even for them, firsthand eyewitness testimony did not do it for them, not until they saw the risen Jesus. Even for Thomas, it wasn't until he said, I want the same thing. I want to believe, Thomas was saying, but I can't because I haven't seen him. I'm going to wait until I see him. That's totally rational. That's totally fine. But what's fascinating in the Thomas account is that when Thomas does see Jesus face to face, Jesus doesn't berate him for his position. He doesn't say, what's your problem? I sent you the women. I sent you the guys to Emmaus. I sent you the other 10. Why didn't you believe? What is your problem? He doesn't berate him like that. He doesn't take him down. He says, look, you want to believe? How's this? So God's in the business of accommodating our disbelief. Remember that guy in the Gospels who came up to Jesus, and Jesus, he's appealing for healing in his family, and Jesus starts to take him down a little bit for his lack of belief. And then he says a marvelous thing. He says, well, I believe, but I don't believe. I want to believe. Help my unbelief. And that was that phrase, that appeal is not lost on God. Help my unbelief. And that's what he wants to do. This phrase, I asked you if you recognize it. Indeed, it comes from the very thing we've been talking about. From John's Gospel, chapter 20, is the account of Thomas himself. He held it because he said, I want to be sure. I just want to be sure. I want to believe, but I don't have enough rational information to believe. But I want to believe. I think critics of most faith religions look at the faiths and say, well, they believe despite evidence. They believe when they don't have evidence. They just use their force of will to fool themselves into believing. But from the biblical accounts, that's not the way God operates. He wants you to have whatever it takes for you to believe. In the end, you will have to make a choice whether to embrace the evidence, but he'll give you enough evidence. And that's what he wants to do, is give you enough evidence so that you believe. He wants you to understand and believe. He wanted Thomas to believe, and he waited until he could show him his hands and his feet. And Thomas said, okay, I'm in. There's another place that there's irrefutable evidence for the resurrection. And John himself stated this at the end of his gospel. That parchment on the left there is an actual real live picture of a parchment of the 2nd century. I think it's not of John. I think it's of 1 Timothy. I can't remember exactly. If you can read Greek, you can correct me. I can't remember. But it's a biblical text right here. But what John writes in his text, which looked a lot like this, John wrote at the end of his gospel and said something just earth-shattering in terms of evidence. This is chapter 20 of John's Gospel, verse 30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. Wouldn't you love to know? Not written in this book. You can only fit so much in. However, he gives a caveat to that and says, yet, 31, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. So John claims that he's put enough in his gospel. It's enough there for you to have the evidence you need to believe. There's enough there. It's largely why when we talk to people who don't share our faith and our beliefs, we try and get them to read a gospel, and primarily John. John's gospel is interesting in many respects. It covers already the most unique scenes in the Gospels. Out of the 4 Gospels, if you compare the overlap and the non-overlap, John's has the most unique perspective stuff. It's almost as though, since we know John's Gospel was written later than the other 3, it's almost as though he read the other 3 and said, I'm going to write me a gospel too, and they left a bunch of things out. I'm going to fill in the gaps with things they didn't talk about. So the most unique scenes in all the Gospels are in John, they're in John. And even at that, John says, I left a lot out. But there's enough there for you to believe, and then believing to have life in his name. That in the 21st century is the evidence that's sufficient for believing, is what's in the Gospels. And that's why we spend a lot of time in the Word. That's why it's always good for you to go back and read a Gospel frequently, even if you're reading other parts of the Word. There is power there in that story, and the story itself, in many ways, is self-authenticating. one of the most self-authenticating things about the gospel is what happens historically after these events that we read right here. And that history unfolds really nicely in Acts as the apostles start spreading the word around, and you see what goes on. But even outside of the book of Acts, you see what happens in the Eastern Mediterranean and in most of Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and even over into the edges of Asia. You see this gigantic, what I call a tidal wave of cultural change. What caused the tidal wave? We know today that tidal waves are caused by under the ocean movements of ground or earthquakes or something like that. A tidal wave always has a cause. Well, there's a tidal wave culture that swept over the world starting in that century, that unless you come up with an explanation that is as radical and over the top as the resurrection of Jesus, you're not going to be able to explain it. It's just impossible to explain by any other means. Well, it was hysteria. Yeah, it was like a mob hysteria thing sort of that happened. Well, not if it was a lie, then why would the apostles willingly die for it? I mean, there's a lot of things about this cultural tidal wave that are hard to explain unless something of such great magnitude as the resurrection actually happened. That would galvanize a tidal wave. And that's what we see in history. So my appeal to any of us is to believe. And I would suggest start with the Gospel of John. But Mark's been pretty great. And we've loved it. So today, what we do is we believe and we celebrate this belief that he himself has accommodated us for our doubts. He's brought us to himself. We believed, we've seen enough evidence. We say, okay, I'm in. And when we sing about the fact that he is more than just a historical Nazarene who went on a preaching tour for 3 years in Israel, he indeed is Lord of all because he's risen from the dead. And he conquered death itself. And that's what we celebrate. It's not a matter of just embracing the historical Jesus. It's a matter of embracing who Jesus is from a cosmic perspective. The promised Messiah, the Son of God, the one in whom, if you believe, you find life in his name. So let's pray. Father, we thank you. Thank you first for this book of Mark. It's been a delight to read through the accounts that are there. It's been a delight to reacquaint ourselves with the life and times of Jesus. And it's been a delight to see the reaction and effect on the populations that went with him. And Lord, today in the resurrection, we celebrate the fact that you have testified to the world that there is one who's quite different from all the others. And Paul, as he told the Athenians, he said it's the resurrection that proves to you the fact that he is something different than all the rest. So we celebrate who he is as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And we celebrate the defeat of death itself. So thanks for this in Jesus' name. Amen.